My mom wants to spend the weekend at the lake house. I'm happy for her, but she wants to go to our lake house. That's not happening. Dylan stared at his phone screen, the three words making his coffee taste bitter. Weekend at lake? His mom Sharon had this way of phrasing things like questions when they were really commands. 23 years of marriage to his dad had taught her that trick. He'd been avoiding this conversation for months. Every family dinner ended the same way, Sharon mentioning how sad it was that the Cedar Falls house sat empty, how Dad would have wanted them to use it. What she didn't say, what she couldn't understand, was that Dylan had his reasons for staying away. The phone buzzed again, then again. Sharon's patience lasted about as long as her morning coffee. We need to talk about this avoidance, read the latest message. Dylan rubbed his temples. 2 years since the funeral and his mom still acted like grief had an expiration date, like you could just dust off the painful memories and get back to normal family life. She had no clue what those final months at the lake house had done to him. His secretary poked her head in. Your 2 o'clock is here. Give me 5 minutes. When he looked at his phone again, Sharon had escalated. I'm driving up there tomorrow morning, with or without you. Game over. Dylan knew his mom well enough to recognize an ultimatum when he saw one. She'd go to that house alone, probably spend the weekend crying and calling him every hour to guilt him into joining her next time. He couldn't let that happen. He grabbed his keys and headed for the parking garage. Sometimes being a good son meant protecting your mother from herself. The lake house looked smaller than Dylan remembered, like it had shrunk under the weight of everything that happened there. Sharon's car was already in the driveway, and through the windows he could see her moving around inside, probably trying to resurrect some ghost of their old family summers. She'd left the front door open, typical Sharon, always assuming the best of people and situations. Dylan found her in the kitchen, humming while she wiped down counters that hadn't seen dust in 2 years. You came, she said without turning around. Her voice had that fake brightness she'd perfected during Dad's worst months. Did I have a choice? Sharon finally looked at him, and Dylan caught something desperate in her eyes before she smiled. We used to be happy here, all three of us. There it was, the past tense that carried a world of accusation. Dylan felt his shoulders tense. His mom had this talent for making her disappointment sound like casual conversation. Things change, Mom. They don't have to. She was wiping the same spot on the counter over and over now, her movements getting sharper. Your father worked so hard to buy this place. He dreamed of grandchildren playing on that dock someday. The guilt hit exactly where Sharon aimed it. Dad had loved this house, had spent every weekend here the last few years before he got sick. But what Sharon conveniently forgot was how those weekends had ended, with Dad confused and angry, asking Dylan why the house felt different, why nothing looked familiar anymore. Mom, you need to stop. Stop what? Caring about our family's legacy? Dylan's patience finally snapped. You weren't here when it mattered. You don't get to decide what Dad would have wanted. Sharon went very still, her dish rag suspended mid-wipe. Dylan knew he'd crossed a line, but 2 years of swallowing his anger had reached its limit. I was here plenty, she said quietly. I visited. You visited when he was having good days, when you could pretend everything was normal. Dylan's voice was getting louder, but he couldn't stop himself. But I lived through the bad days. I was the one who found him wandering the dock at midnight in his pajamas, scared and calling for his dead sister. Sharon's face crumpled. That's not fair. Fair? Dylan laughed, but it came out harsh. You want to know what's not fair? Dad asking me to promise I'd take care of you, and then in the same breath telling me to sell this place because he knew what it would do to us. The admission hung between them like a physical thing. Dylan had never told his mother about that last conversation, partly because he'd hoped he'd never have to choose between his father's wishes and his mother's needs. He was confused that night. He wasn't confused about that. Dylan moved to the window, staring out at the dock where he'd found his father that terrible night. He was clearer than he'd been in months. He said some houses hold too much sadness to ever be homes again. Sharon sank into one of the kitchen chairs, looking suddenly older than her 62 years. I sold my house in Bloomington last month. The words hit Dylan like cold water. His mom's suburban house had been her pride and joy for decades. I couldn't stay there either, she continued. Everything reminded me of him. I thought if I could just get us both back here, we could figure out how to be a family again. Dylan finally understood. His mother wasn't trying to torture him with painful memories, she was drowning in her own and grabbing for anything that felt like a life preserver. They sat in the gathering dusk, two people who'd survived the same loss in completely different ways. Dylan had been so focused on protecting himself from this place that he'd missed his mother's desperation entirely. I dream about him too, Sharon said finally, but I dream about the good times, when you were little and we'd spend whole days on the water, your father singing those awful songs while he drove the boat. I remember those summers. Dylan's voice was softer now, but when I'm here, all I can think about is how scared he was at the end, how he didn't recognize this place anymore. Sharon reached across the small kitchen table and took his hand. Her fingers were cold, fragile feeling. What if we both let it go? The words surprised them both. After months of fighting for this house, Sharon was offering to release it. I mean it, she said. If this place hurts you more than it heals you, then your father was right, we should sell it. Dylan felt something loosen in his chest, a knot he'd been carrying for 2 years. There's a family from Minneapolis who's been asking about it. They have young kids. Sharon smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. Dad would like that. He always said houses should be full of children's laughter. As they prepared to leave the next morning, Dylan felt lighter than he had in months. The lake house would become someone else's beginning instead of their ending. He and his mom would find new ways to remember his father, ways that didn't require them to live in the shadow of their worst memories. Some battles weren't worth winning. Some houses were meant to be released, and sometimes the most loving thing you could do was admit when it was time to let go.